I did think that, as a depression sufferer myself, I thought that the way that depression, the internal experience of it, was represented by having different characters within, with a different voice, like an actual way of speaking, but also just a different narrative voice, a completely different way of communicating, tying it back to biological systems. Like, this is your limbic system speaking. This is your superego. It's like, that is unheard of compared to the video games of as little as 10 years ago. So I think it's a very exciting time to be making or playing games that deal with headier topics like that.
Well, I was definitely thinking about Depression Quest earlier, and I think one big thing that game touched on that can be important in the context of games for mental health is how the seemingly good options are blocked off, because, say, the starting situation, as I remember from the very first iteration, is you have to try to start working on something, and the option to just power through and work a normal night is grayed out. And so you choose what seems to be the less bad options. Now, there's been a decade of innovation in both mental health understanding and game development since Depression Quest came out. I'm honestly not on top of all the stuff that has happened in game development, although I still need to play Disco Elysium. That's next on the agenda.
That's so good.
But I believe Depression Quest was a noble endeavor to try to show how the obvious option isn't always easy. Now, that said, it does still suffer from the basic problem of real life decisions are not as easy as video game decisions, in the sense that you could still be choosing the option that seems the less crap and it'll still give you a happy ending in Depression Quest. But when dealing with mental health, even the seemingly less crappy option is not always obvious. And I think as much as mental health can cloud people's judgments, at the end of the day, we're all working with the best information that we got. Whatever we're dealing with, we're going to make the option that is most logical and rational to us, even if it's not objectively rational. And I think that's an important thing to understand for a lot of different reasons. But when it comes to mental health, I think it's also important to rationalize that in some ways, your body and your mind limit the ways that you can actually make a decision, whether that's paralyzing you with fear or whether it's making you more upset about something. The most I can share is that I've got OCD, and while it's not necessarily an extreme case, I do have things that I'm involuntarily grossed out by. Like, I don't like gum, for example. I don't like seeing people chewing gum. That's a turn off for me. So it's a little bit like that. You can also sort of compare mental health to a physical illness, especially say if that illness is an allergy, in the way that an allergy makes you involuntarily sick towards something, whether it's, again, pollen or whether it's by consuming meat. So that's a big thing to consider. So where it comes back to games, I think one way that games would benefit from depicting mental illness is ironically showing how they can take away agency or how they can impact your decisions, so that you're not making the objectively correct decision, or rather you're not making the decision that you think is best. You're working with what you have for mental illness or for a game storyline. Another game that I think does this relatively interestingly but not perfectly is Crusader Kings 3, which introduced a stress function such that if you have certain personality traits, like if you're paranoid or craven, you can't do things that a brave character would do. So because acting brave would make you more stressed out, and if you have stress breaks, then that'll cause your character to either lash out or suffer illness. Such and such examples of mental health.
And games.
Yeah,
It's good stuff.
yeah. So I think it will be a hot take, but I think one way that games could reflect that is showing where mental health can impact one's agency, even if that means either limiting the amount of decisions you can make or impacting, having more consequences for the decisions that you do make with your character. And that's my piece. I yield the floor.
Like the mental part and kind of the physical part, I feel like most of the time when I'm having a struggle with my mental health, it really helps me to get out of my head and do something with my body. And I wonder if I know there's like, I don't know, I'm not a gamer, so I only know like the Wii Fit as like a physical game. But I wonder if there's a way to kind of like prompt through a device to like take a deep breath or to like touch your toes, touch your nose or something like that. I mean, that's pretty basic, but more in a game way. Like, you have to dig, like, I don't know, I'm thinking about like AR potentially. Like, you have to like dig. I don't know.
I like that.
Like, dig. But there's a way to kind of get out of your head a little bit as a kind of a respite from what could potentially be going on.
Something may have already been talked about, sorry, I'm enjoying. Giving people tools in order to understand and notice what is going on inside of them and what's alive inside of them is something that is a lot harder than it appears at first. And something that I have found for myself that helps me is to understanding things through different lenses, like, and having ways that we can view these things, lenses that help us to categorize. So the three lenses that I like to look at with my own mental well-being, I like to look at it through the lens of, okay, is the feeling I'm experiencing a state of grasping, like reaching for something that I want to be different? Is it a state of aversion, pushing away of something that I don't want to be the experience, or indifference? And those are the three kind of like, indifference being like, I just don't care about any of this. So in those three different states, those are all completely like different experiential ways of having an unwellness arise. But we're not really taught these things. We're not taught to understand feelings of grasping, aversion, and indifference. We're taught a lot of other words for these things, but we don't necessarily have the same frameworks that we're working from in order to understand them. So something that I like to do is just like creating questions to check in with yourself. Well, I just saw a great quote by a poet who I follow who I really love, who said something along the lines of, I can measure my mental well-being on any given day based on how much of my focus is on what I'm able to give to others versus what I'm not getting from others. And I thought that was a really helpful, and like, I think that those things can be taught through game design. I think they can be mechanized. There's always a danger, like any sharp tool, it can be used as a knife, right? So we have to be careful, I think, with how we go about using different mental health tools in practice.
This conversation is actually making me think about how you began your talk with a breathing exercise, which is something I don't do it every day, but I do it with my students as needed, which is more than you'd think. And I'm thinking about like my own like work and getting to like a best place mental health wise that I've ever been in my life has largely been the work of reading and interpreting physical feedback, lots of breathing exercises like that. There's a physical component to depression, to anxiety. And if you can see that, well, it's objective. You can see it, touch it, you can judge it really. And then you can assess it and know what it really is, and it, more importantly, is not. Video games, half of the work is providing feedback to the player so they can understand their avatar, so they can understand often the internal experience of this fictionalized self. Like, you're playing Doom, the screen flashes red to indicate that you've been hurt. Your guy starts to slow down if you've been running too long, et cetera, et cetera. What if you had a game that is built around those same systems of feedback, but it's not physical factors, it's your emotional state? It could be an RPG, but instead of strength, agility, it's emotional resilience, it's self-esteem. Take all of those things that go into a person's self and make that the avatar instead of a measurement of their ability to, kick ass and chew bubblegum.
Yeah, I think what you're pointing to is what I like to think of as the difference between a confidence that comes from knowing that you have all the hit points in the world, right? Like there's you have acquired something, you are the arbiter of something, you own something, versus a confidence that comes from knowing that regardless of what comes up, you'll find a way to handle the situation. That it's not about your skill bank, it's about having the self-knowledge that you'll navigate your way, that you may not know exactly what's going to happen or how you're going to deal with it or what skills you're going to need, but you know that you'll be okay. And those are very different states. One can easily be assaulted and taken from you, the other cannot.
Different forms of game feedback would absolutely convince the player of a different version of themselves. Like we're in a system now where pretty much all games are about that other type of feedback, the building up of skills and points and so on and so forth. But there's very little, I don't know, there's not as much improvisation in gaming as it really seems like there ought to be. Like not in meaningful ways.
And that's where like the TTRPG, like Dungeons and Dragons comes in, because then it's like certain systems are not as rules heavy. Like I can just min-max. It's like I have to figure out this problem, and all I have is a stick and a shield. And then that's where you get that other kind of problem solving. It's like, well, it's just me. Better not die.
I have to figure out a problem. I mean, what are video games better at than teaching resilience? I mean, that's like the number one point I keep coming back to with teachers who are convinced I'm trying to destroy their students by putting video games in their hands. It's that like these kids, when you lose at a video game, what do? Do you rage quit, throw your controller on the floor and never play the game again? You know, I mean, yeah, you suck, but you can do that. But no, you don't. You try again immediately in most cases. Like, you play a game like Super Meat Boy. How does that game do anything but teach grit? The one thing that teachers and parents bitch endlessly about kids lacking. I mean, I see nothing in that game other than a grit manufacturing machine.
So speaking of Super Meat Boy, the game that I wanted to bring up at some point was Celeste, because for me, Celeste just handles mental health in a very nice way. And like, on the one hand, there's that contrast between Celeste being a very difficult game and it being about perseverance and like, so Celeste, for those of you who may not know, Celeste is a game about climbing a mountain, and the main character, Madeline, has trouble with anxiety and depression. And so climbing this mountain is kind of her way of overcoming this. And so there's an interesting combination of mechanic with story there, where you overcoming the challenge of beating the game is kind of analogous with Celeste overcoming her anxiety and depression. But I'm just thinking about the way that that is presented in the game is very much in addition to the mechanics, the storytelling is just very good there, with it having little interludes in between where Celeste is grappling with it, and it kind of telling about, specifically in conversations she has with another one of the characters, she has conversations about her depression and anxiety and what it feels like, and then ways to possibly overcome it by breathing slowly and imagining a feather are like introduced. And then also it goes into things about, oh, depression isn't something that you can just get rid of forever. It is something that you learn to work with, and there's a good chance that it will always be a part of your life. So just thinking of all these different angles at which you can come from to talk about mental health, whether that is strategies to overcome it or whether that is just talking about what it is. And that's useful for both people who may not fully understand it and useful for people who have it who want to feel seen.
Matt, did you already talk about Through a Glass?
No.
Do you mind explaining?
No, I don't mind.
So I'll let you describe what it is, but Matt has developed a game specifically about this sort of thing, and I think it's relevant to the conversation right now.
Yeah, so for my thesis project, last year, I guess, I've since graduated, I made a game called Through a Glass, and it is a game that talks about depersonalization, derealization disorder, and it focuses on allowing players to, in some way, experience what it's like to have dissociative symptoms, and then at the same time, follow this character through her journey of like learning about what that means for her and learning different coping strategies and doing them along with her. So I know before we talked about like replicating breathing exercises or some kind of physical thing in a game. So it was my intention that even though this wasn't like an AR game or a VR game or even just a physical tabletop game, I wanted the gameplay mechanics to replicate when you do them in the game, to replicate how you would do them in real life. So similar to Celeste with the feather going up and down with breathing, I instead had a mini game within the game, where you would follow breathing exercises by clicking and holding and filling up a circle, and doing the 4-second, breathe in, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, hold. And once the player had performed that correctly, X number of times or however many seconds, you could move on. But when I was playtesting it with people, I found that a lot of times they would do the breathing exercises with it. And that was my intention for that. And there's a couple other different instances that I included as well. But yeah, if anyone has any questions about that, feel free to ask.
The thing
Yeah,
I
can
think
you play
about it's visually really interesting. I think it is, you can just go play it online, right? You can download it. Or
Yeah.
there's a version of it on Mac's webpage, but one of the things I really like about it is the aesthetic, where it becomes visually fuzzier, the more depersonalized and derealized, the more you're experiencing dissociative disorder. And that comes back into frame and gets hardened edges as you regain your sense of place. So it really does a nice job integrating all of these various aspects of game systems, where it's not just the mechanics, it's not just the story, it's also the aesthetic values and how all of those things play off of one another to make sure that you're really getting the point or the thesis of the entire experience. So yeah. Go play it, it's really good.
You have a website that we can.
I do, yes. I have a QR code, or it's just macfox.com.
Macfox.com?
Yes,
Cool.
with a K.
Sounds good.
And yeah, there's a couple bugs, so I'm sorry,
In that game.
it was a bit of a rushed project in some ways.
Obsidian, Bethesda.
I think it's really interesting how, like, the way you described Celeste and your description of Depression Quest, like, these are two games for two very different audiences. Like, it sounds like Celeste, and it sounds like your game too, well, I would say Celeste probably sounds more like it's a game for people suffering from depression or anxiety, because it's kind of like there to make you feel seen and you're not alone, you're understood. Whereas it sounds like your game, and with Depression Quest, that's more like help it be understood and help it be experienced and gain empathy for people who don't suffer from it, which is kind of like the big one for me. It's because like people with mental health disorders, like they know, they're aware it sucks, but people who haven't experienced it, like there's so much that could be done just for society and empathy for other people. And a kind of different tangent, a different way that games and virtual reality are working in this field right now. I read in a section of a book about a game that the author demoed at a conference, where it was a helmet with like sensors. They don't need gel on you to put it on your head anymore. And I guess you are looking at a chicken running down the road, and you have to think about the chicken running. And if you stop thinking about the chicken running, it stops running. If you think about it running, it runs. But if you get distracted by the game's graphics, if you like start looking at that cloud over in the sky, or you start thinking about, what are you having for dinner, the chicken stops and won't run again until you get a completely cleared, focused mind. So this is a completely different angle to approach it at. It's like the feedback, the physical feedback is actually coming from your body in this time. We're not using reference or metaphor anymore to talk about the physical feedbacks of anxiety and depression. We're actually putting them to work, and you're not practicing doing the thing. You're doing the thing. That's amazing to me.
My capstone engineering project was using one of those headsets.
How'd it go?
It is hard.
Sure. Like actually operating it?
Yeah, like made a game that used it with some other people, but basically it's like you have to like spend several sessions like training the game to know what it looks like when you're thinking a certain thought, and then you can use that thought later to do things.
I see.
But
That's
it's
very
like
cool.
once you have more than two things you're trying to do, it becomes very iffy.
Interesting.
How far back is coming?
True that.
I remember doing a very simplified version of that once. Instead of a headset, it was just like a headband and sound.
Yeah.
And it was just clear your mind. And as you did, the like wave sounds that were happening in the audio project, whatever, the phone, would get quieter, and the storm would turn into a gentle rain, and then the birds would start singing because you're fully relaxed and you're not thinking. And I remember doing it, and every single time I would hear the birds, I'd go, "Oh, the birds," and in my head, and then the thunder of So it's interesting to hear how far it's come.
Yeah, the book was The Game Believes in You by Greg Topo. It's really good. If anyone, if there happens to be anyone here who's interested in video games and education, it's specifically about video games and education. So fantastic book. It's the reason why I'm here right now.
Oh, yeah.
So like the headbands one does like use devices, because like I've also heard about this. Thing with like a headband and meditate.
Yes, it was that.
Yeah, I actually also like tried to recreate something like this. One of my classes, something like we use, and I work with Arduino devices. It's basically like very small and like affordable computers, and they have like different sensors. For example, they have like pulse sensor, breath sensor, like nothing complicated, but like at least something. And it's also like kind of amazing how can you like measure the pulse, and for example tell like the person that they're like not very well off, but they're anxious, and through breathing, like through calculating if they breathe like correctly, to like give feedbacks that they're doing great. And I think that like when we have like this goal in video game and we kind of get like immersed into like this goal, we try to like do with our bodies something to like to come to this goal, and like it helps to like come down and come down.
It's definitely interesting how games are being used to both heighten one's senses and ground oneself, and provide visceral experiences of something else. And what you mentioned before with grounding, I think that is especially prevalent and especially necessary depending on the game. Like your game with the reading through a glass, it was called, right? I also think that the way that the screen distorts it is also especially interesting, and I feel like there's a parallel to be made between how. Nope. Sorry about that. But there's definitely an interesting comparison to be made between how your game distorts the screen and how other games distort theirs. Like the classic example is how military shooters will make the screen red in order to indicate you've been damaged, and what you need to do is then hide behind cover in order to recover. And that something like that is supposed to prompt you to take a defensive measure to course correct. And I think it is interesting in the sense that your game specifically focuses on what it's like to go through that experience and how another game will treat that as a way to counteract an otherwise stressful situation or remove yourself from a troubling situation. So I think this is a little hard for me to articulate, but just through this conversation, it has made me a little more keenly aware about how games will harness stress, so to speak, and how so much of building resilience or trying to beat challenges is about trying to control a stress response, so to speak, or try to weaponize your stress towards accomplishing a certain target, which can be interesting, but also depending on the game, also bad, because obviously stress is bad and also it's just a game. So that can obviously be bad, but then at the same time, this is all taking place within a safe environment. Like even if it's a multiplayer game, even if it's a ranked match, all of it is within a safe, controlled space where you get to articulate these emotions, where you get to simulate them and then walk away whenever you like.
There's different types of stress, right? There's like eustress, which is basically like beneficial stress or useful stress, motivating stress.
Yeah.
Like the stress we see, the stress we feel that motivates us to get out in the streets and protest, right?
Yeah.
There are ways in which like stress can be useful to spur us to action. And I think that part of the danger that we face as game designers is falling into the trap of thinking that all emotions that we want to provoke should be positive, should feel good. And that's not necessarily beneficial, right? Because we need to just accept where we are. And in accepting where we are, we develop that resilience, right? We're able to abide in whatever weather is going on, regardless of what the weather is. And I think as game designers, we have a tendency within our community to say, no, only sunny things ever. Like, and that becomes something that's dangerous, especially when we're talking about mental health. It's like, well, no, we're trying to fix. We want to fix this problem, and that's not actually useful. It's teaching people about how to sit still while the thunderstorm is going on.
Actually, let me think about like another game. I'm not sure if you've heard about Greece.
That game,
Need to play that.
that's so beautiful.
Yeah, it's like a very beautiful game, and it's essentially about stages of grief. So you come like through the sorrow, then anger, then like other stages. And in each stage, you acquire a mechanic. For example, when you're like angry, you like turn into a cube, and like this cube is very like slow, but it also protects you from the wind. And like since slow, you can just like float in the water, swim. And I like how like the game progresses. So you kind of going through each motion, you keep something from this motion, like and it's not like necessarily like as you said that anger is something bad. Like no, it gives you something to like to progress in the future. And I like how like this game is only like 3 hours, but it takes you through like all of those different mechanics, and like at the end you're like a very like character with a lot of like mechanics, a lot of abilities, so you can do different things because like you went through them. Like yeah, just like also great example. Yes,
That's beautiful.
It is, and that game is one of the most amazing looking games I have ever seen.
yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Stunning.
Can anybody, because I know mine, but I'm interested in hearing yours. Can anyone remember the first time that they can recall a video game putting them someplace else mentally? Where before you picked up that controller or that keyboard, you were in one mental state, and by the time you were done, you were not.
I think for me, it was Portal 2.
Nice. How did Portal do that? What did it do to you?
I felt like the characters and the storytelling was so strong, and it had that resilience that made me gave me resilience that made me keep trying to figure out these puzzles that were challenging and so much fun and rewarding in that I could progress this story that I was so invested in. That when I was finished with it, I was like, Wow, I want to do that again. That's great.
Did you ever finish the first Portal? The
I
first Portal is,
think I did, yeah.
I love the ending of that.
So
I
good.
can't spoil for anyone, but
Of course.
that game had it was such an ambiguous ending. That one did it for me. Any others?
Resident Evil 1.
Was it the moment
It was
at the
partly the moment.
beginning?
This was like, I now love horror games, but at the time I was like afraid of everything. But that was before I understood that games were like things that were designed to be beaten and have a fixed like endpoint.
Yeah.
Like, and as like when I was younger playing that game, I'm like, this takes me to a place that is just dangerous and bad and wants to hurt me. And like I didn't comprehend it, like, oh, this has mechanics where like someone built this for me to beat it. Like that's the end goal of this product. It was just like, oh, this is like a scary place and it's bad.
But yeah. Yeah, that first zombie lifts his head in that intro scene. It almost takes the like stink of that awful voice acting and the intro.
I played the GameCube version, so.
Oh, so you spared yourself.
I did.
You should watch it anyway, just for
Oh, yeah,
its amazing badness. You're the master of picking books.
This is kind of shifting topics. I don't know if there was something else you wanted to say, but
No, I got more to say.
but so for my thesis project at UConn, for my Master's of Fine Arts thesis project, I went through a couple things when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to make a VR experience, but one of the things that was before I figured out what I was actually going to do, one of the prior things was making a VR experience about grief. And again, the stages of denial or the stages of grieving. And it was hard. So like I started it out and I was trying to come up with mechanics and I was like, oh, okay, so I'm going to have some different things you can do. There's going to be, you have an ability to use fire because that's kind of like I'm forgetting the actual stages of grief. Denial.
Bargaining's in there.
Anger is one of them.
Yeah, anger, denial.
Bargaining. Well,
Posting on that.
anyway, yeah, but there were like several different mechanics where it's like, oh, fire is kind of like anger, and so like have it so that you use that in there to burn up certain things, but then it catches other things on fire, and gosh, I can't even remember what other things were. But so I spent a lot of time on it because I got a decent number of mechanics implemented, and then I took a step back and I was like, this is like very metaphorical, and it's not making me feel the things that I want it to make me feel. Like I kind of got lost in trying to generate metaphors, and then I realized that like while there might be moments, like one of the ones that I was particularly interested in doing was kind of for like depression, making it so that the gameplay mechanics themselves stop doing what you want them to do and having the game itself break down, because that feels like one of the best ways to make you feel that emotion is you are trying to do something that has always worked one way and then all of a sudden it stops working that way. But anyway, I then switched over to trying to make it a little bit more story-based because metaphor felt a bit too hard to grasp for me and it wasn't having the emotional impact I wanted. So I started having it be much more of a narrative experience that involved like your relationship with a mother who passed away and a sister, and trying to I don't really know where I'm going with this, just that I ended up switching off of it entirely because I was like, wow, it was much harder than I expected. And in fact, that's happened several times throughout my life where I have tried to make some piece of art about the emotions I've experienced throughout my life and haven't quite been able to do it because they're the emotions are there within me, but I don't know how to properly display them in a way that other people can get. So
I struggled with that so much when I was working on my thesis.
I think it's called being an artist.
Maybe switch the format, you know, like sometimes for certain things that are felt, the best experience to deliver that experience is not necessarily a digital game, or is not necessarily a board game, or is not necessarily a live action game. So experimenting with the format in which you're designing is something I'd heavily encourage. Make a art.
I was just gonna say,
That's
she's going into See, I'm sorry, babe. Yeah, there was one thing that you said that I wanted to respond to, and I completely forgot. Sorry.
no, I said a lot of things. I'm sorry.
It'll come.
I had something I wanted to comment on, which is, so I mentioned before about how we all make what we believe to be the most rational decision given the circumstances we're in. God, I think that's one thing I personally really want to explore in games. To give a very short version of what I have planned, one thing I would love to potentially explore for a master subject would be a game about putting on a food festival, but it's actually a project management simulator because putting on the festival means you've got to talk with people, you've got to organize stuff, you got to account for pitfalls, that sort of thing. And it would be a game about both working with what you got and doing the right thing even when it's hard. And that brings me to a game that I've really been thinking about lately, which is Papers, Please. That is a game that does a great job of doing an edifying job, just showing you what it's like to be in the shoes of an immigrant official and also, or customs board official, and showing you what sort of hard decisions or snap decisions you have to make under pressure, because it's obviously not a game about mental health, but it is obviously a game where you are going to have to balance being a good worker with being a compassionate person, if you so choose, with making sure your family is fed. So you've got these three competing things. And the first is always perpetually complicated because the rules change and you have to deal with a dizzying array of papers. The game builds up to the point that you get used to it, but it's still like things get more and more complicated, and there are a lot of times where you have to sometimes either bend your morals or bend the rules in order to let something happen. And doing so comes at a direct cost, which is sort of what I think games about mental health should explore, in the sense that making a decision that can bring you stress or dealing with a mental illness or condition cannot be a straightforward answer of what is objectively correct. It's what makes the most sense to you, what appeals most to you. And again, Papers, Please is a great game about showing what things take priority and how other people would have to work in these circumstances. And that approaches onto larger topics such as authoritarianism, immigration, et cetera, and there's a lot I can unpack there.
So interesting, when you're saying that, what was coming up in my mind was this idea that that action is not always tied to outcome.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and in games, we create systems by which action ties to outcome. Because that's necessary, we have to say, if this, then that. But what if the outcome is randomized, right? What if there's, just like life, you don't know. You're like, oh, I'm taking a day to self-care. And then that day turns into a day in which your mother calls you and dumps a whole bunch of junk on your floor, you know what I mean? Like, and then And you're like, oh, if I had gone out with my friends, this wouldn't have happened. I wouldn't have answered when my mom called me, like, so you don't even know necessarily what the outcomes are gonna be.
Yeah,
You take the action because you take the action, right? Like you have to decide and there's not a right answer kind of thing.
yeah. And
Interesting.
I would like to directly respond to that because that definitely has a strong element, especially when it comes to D&D. Like that's a classic example of just because you want to do something does not mean you're going to be successful about it. Um, One area where I think that it has a place, but is not always so easy is like when doing text options or whatnot, because on one hand, I think it is important to have an element of randomization in some circumstances. On the other hand, you have games like really just Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 where the dialogue can have a random chance to succeed if you're doing speech options. And a lot of players don't like that, at least not in comparison to, say, Fallout New Vegas, where speech checks are a lot more binary. Either you pass them or you don't. And the issue I think the issue that would have to be addressed there is like I think randomization works for like riskier decisions. And I know some games work on that, especially when they don't already have like a dedicated speech craft system. But God, I've got a lot of feelings that are tied to Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 here. But I think you're absolutely right about randomization, about that playing a part, and also about outcome not being action not being tied to outcome, which is another thing that I've been really thinking a lot about during this talk. So thank you for bringing that up.
I love the idea of randomization, particularly when you play with player awareness of the randomization, because like how much you know has a big effect on it. Like if I were in this room, but I was in a digital representation of this room and I knew it was designed by a designer, the first thing I would think is some shit is about to go down. You know how I know? Flickering lights. They would have not put these damn lights in here unless it was a warning. But because I am IRL right now, as far as I don't know, those red pills. I know it's random, so I'm not worried about a xenomorph dropping down from the ceiling.
Yeah.
Any more than I usually. But yeah, it's amazing how. But then, like, if it was a game, but I was aware that there was a mechanic. The lights might blink randomly. It doesn't mean a damn thing.
Yeah.
I probably still think that something was going to go wrong because we probably all feel a teeny bit in our subconscious like something bad is going to happen, a little more than we would if those lights were flickering. I mean, but are we aware of this right now? Like, as I look at these things, so like I know I'm like 2% less comfortable and 2% more afraid of xenomorph right now than I normally would be. Anyone else feeling it? Like, can you look within and find that?
I feel not necessarily for a xenomorph, but I
Yeah.
do feel my attention is compromised by the lights flickering because I'm noticing myself looking at them. So if something's competing for my attention, then I know that I'm present too.
Intent means so much, or lack thereof.
If I may, that's a better point about awareness. Is essentially having to keep track of information and keeping track of what is salient is a big thing. And that's also going back to favorites, please. That's what makes that such a big thing is that you have to keep track of what is up to date, what rules still apply, what needs to be, what are you expected to penalize people on and reject people on? Awareness is a big thing. Consequently, the thing I really wanted to say about Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 has to do with awareness. So when you're talking about mental health and when you're talking about morality, I think the thing that a lot of things about video games is that if you have an option between being a good, nice person and being an evil jerk, people are going to go for the nice option because it seems the most straightforward. Unless they feel like the evil option for the heck of it. Like, rarely are people going to go with the evil option because they think it's the objectively correct option. But if there's some sort of ambiguity to it where they don't actually know what the right answer is, then you're gonna get a lot more skewed responses. A very famous example of this is how one of the developers of Mass Effect cited that statistics wise, 92% of the players chose the good guy option when playing the first time around. And they got results that were more balanced towards good and bad when the good and bad options were less clear cut and also less explicitly tied to morality. And as far as mental health, I think that's another saying that plays a part. This goes back to what I said about Depression Quest, where the limitations of the system meant it wasn't as challenging to choose the less costly options as it was in real life. Like, granted, it's a well-developed game. I don't want to give that impression that it's not. I think it's a good game. It's just that it sticks with me in a sense of doing the right decision is not as simple as clicking a button. And I think that introducing that sort of nuance, whether you're talking about moral systems or whether you're talking about dealing with a mental illness disorder, those would be big things to explore, and those are things I personally want to explore when designing a game that would touch on these themes.
There's one more thing that's kind of on my mind that I don't think we've touched on at all. I mean, we're all gamers and game designers in here, so everyone thinks like in universe, in game.
Yeah.
We haven't had any out of game conversations. We're talking about like the things that happen within games that impact mental health. What I've been thinking about a lot is my students and how video games, the actual machine, whatever it may be, as an actual artifact in their real life. And it goes so beyond the content of the games. Biggest one is male relationships. I've a lot of my students have, some of the more disadvantaged ones. They don't have regular, close, physical, proximity relationships with their fathers, but they game with their dads. These are kids who, for whatever reason, divorce, moving away, whatever it is, they're just there. But their dads are part of these kids' lives because they game together, because they share that. There's this one kid who I've kind of, been trying to check in with because he's not doing okay, but he's selectively mute. No one believes in him. None of the teachers believe in him. They will say to me in front of him, "Oh, don't bother trying to get him to work. He doesn't do his work." And yeah, well, okay. And I wait for them to leave. We both watch them leave, and we both breathe the same damn sigh of relief. Oh, he's gone. How you doing? What are you playing? And the games that he loves, and I mean a capital L, love, they're his lifeline. They're what connects him, not just to other people, but to the world. This kid would not be a participant in life at all if it weren't for video games. And when people try to take that away from him, it's like, this kid's barely hanging on. He's in the desert with a drop of water, and you want to take that from him too? What the hell?
Yeah, it kind of speaks to the importance of the community of practice and what are the expectations and goals that are set within that community, as opposed to thinking about it in terms of the community of people designing these games for play with whatever goals they have in mind as designers versus the community of practice of people who actually play these things and for the reasons that they come up with or that are emergent on the fly based on their own lived experiences. So I use the example a lot of Grand Theft Auto and say, because I talk to a lot of teachers, and that's a game they generally are familiar with and dislike because they think of it in all of its negative connotations. And I usually make the argument to them, but think about how the context of that game changes if you give it to a 5-year-old and you, let's say, mute this out so they don't get to hear all the profanity. But that kid's going to play the game as race cars, or I'm going to pretend that I'm going to the grocery store. And it's about creating contexts for those people to interact that are pro-social or positive, that don't necessarily align with the objectives that are set by the community of designers who created it, but are instead aligned with these objectives of a community of play that is organized around pro-social organization. So if you start to break down how people play along different lines than designer, gamer, or this is what a gamer is, as opposed to this is what this person plays a game as, or why they use that game for this purpose. It becomes a lot more meaningful and situated in understanding how an individual makes sense of their own gameplay in the context of their own lived experience. And it's one of the reasons too that I spend a lot of time thinking, how do you actively design for that kind of experience? So I haven't successfully developed this yet. It's still one of those things that's a side project on a side project, but developing a tarot card deck that is explicitly around the idea of externalizing thought and using it as a therapeutic tool as opposed to, predicting the future, which I think tarot generally is about externalizing thought or talking through problems or ways you think about it and think about the world. And there's no reason why you couldn't develop a guidebook that goes along with a tarot set that says, if you get this card and it implies, this emotional experience or this way of seeing the world, how would you align or think about the connections between all of these different cards that you've been dealt? And what does that mean for you and your lived experience? And that gets at what I think you're talking about, which is getting a student who may be selectively mute or they have a hard home life or et cetera, to think through what are some of the things that are within their control and that they actually can contend with as an individual. What are things that are systemically controlled, that are beyond their individual action? And what are strategies you can use or pathways you can follow to get to where you want to be? And I don't think that's a panacea. Like, I think that this is one of those things that you could do as an exercise, but certainly I think a lot about what is the community I am building when I'm developing a game that goes beyond just I want someone to have fun. Like, I think fun is one of the worst words that game designers use, or that teachers use, or that anyone uses, because it's an emotional response that's orthogonal to all of these other things. That really what it comes down to is how gameful is a thing. So like, does it have a rule set that's very strict or very loose? And how playful is it in terms of agency? So can I exert agency over this system, or does the system control me? And if you can get students to kind of think through those lines, it gets them to be able to take more control of themselves and understand that relationship they might have with their dad that they don't have with other people, and get them to value that accordingly so that they can act on it in ways that make their quality of life better.
That is, the way you just described it, that's how it looks to me. Just watching kids in the classroom, the things that they get out of it. The way you put it, what I'm kind of hearing, I don't think you actually put it exactly this way, but what I'm kind of hearing between your words is that when you create something in the studio, the laboratory, I would call it, it's a laboratory condition, it's controlled. Then you put it out into the wild and it's not yours anymore. It takes on a life of its own, and the DNA of every single player gets injected into it and it becomes part of them.
Yep.
One way that I see this happen constantly is that kids never use lobbies in multiplayer games for their intended purpose. Lobbies in multiplayer games have replaced texting. They have their games that they play together. They go into the lobby and they won't play, but they'll like have it open on their phone or on their computer. And where for my generation, it was AOL Instant Messenger. Well, for them, it's whatever game they happen to be playing at the time.
Yep.
This was not the intent, but they needed something and they found it there. They needed a private place where they could talk and the grown-ups wouldn't be listening in, and that's their refuge.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And I just was gonna piggyback off that to say, like, that's what Baron's chat in World of Warcraft was. Like, that people will gamify the game that they're playing in order to fit these other molds or goals that they have co-created. And that's one of the things I try to emphasize to my students too, is that as soon as you publish something into the world and share with other people, it is no longer yours. It is ours. That the ownership of that really goes beyond you as the designer. And Alan Moore is somebody I point to a lot and say, like, don't do what Alan Moore does and bitch and moan about how many people didn't read it correctly. Like, because you published it. Like, that's the point of art, is that people are going to experience it differently. If we all go look at the Mona Lisa, we're all going to get something different out of that experience. And that's because all of us have different life worlds with different experience sets that caused us to be the people we are in that moment. And all of us can be in the same physical room right now, but we're in very different rooms, right? That we're attending to different information in this space. We're tuning our perception to different things. And, I might look at somebody who's, looking at their phone, or that they're writing on a piece of paper or doodling or something, whereas somebody else will find something completely different in that space. And it ends up being really important as a designer to remember that your audience is the same exact way, that whenever you publish something, there may be a word or a visual image or something else that's embedded in that experience that is experienced completely differently for them than it would be anyone else in the entire world. And you kind of have to be okay with that. And not only be okay with it, but actually encourage that sort of exploration so that the game you create is genuinely treated as art as opposed to being one fixed experience. Because what differentiates games and play from all of these other kinds of media, whether it's movies or television, which I would argue you can still interpret, is that they are interactive. They do not exist unless the player is playing them. And so they are a genuine co-author to that experience in a way that I'm not, if, you know, I think Carol probably appreciates that too, like, especially with your job. Like, that's the nature of the beast, is you're trying to figure out how do I personalize this for everybody? In the same way that if I was teaching a class, everybody should have an IEP. Like, that I should be treating every single student as if they have an individualized education plan, like they were in special ed, because all of us are different. There is no one size fits all solution to that. And as soon as you start to recognize that, it makes the job of teaching or designing or whatever much easier, because you can start to customize the experience for everybody who might experience it. Sorry, go ahead.
It's all good. This is so far removed from mental health, but I think it's a hilarious anecdote in regards to what you've been talking about playing games unintentionally, which is I have spent over 100 hours across, say, 2 years, 2014, 2015, playing a game called Mountain Blade Napoleonic Wars, where I would spawn in as a drummer, and my whole goal would be to try to befriend enemy players and convince them to not shoot me by playing my drum. And it also had a chat function, and the chat could also be toxic, but the whole idea was that for me, it was like an opportunity to goof off, and to post very silly things. And it was a fun way for me to cut loose in the same way that some people treat internet forums, that they just joke around, but they have a community. There wouldn't necessarily be the sense of community, but there was a sense of people that I could just put a mask on and be a little jester, so to speak. And also, again, the constant challenge was seeing who would kill me. And I would always get a reputation in the rooms that I did join as being the silly musician. And I stopped that for a little while, but very recently, playing a certain game called Apex Legends, I've been repeating that same step because the character I play has a guitar remote, and my whole idea has been landing alone, playing the guitar, and seeing who befriends me and who shoots me. A lot of people will shoot on sight, but it is fun to see what people are chill and what people are cool. I remember one person gave me health after shooting me a bunch, realizing that I was friendly, and that was especially cool. There are other anecdotes that I can't name off the top of my head, but like that's a way that the developers did not anticipate, especially when it came to fighting games and shooting games. It's just there's a way. It's been fun for me to create this little public spectacle and also find a way to disarm people into convincing them to be friendly in an otherwise combative simulation.
It reminds me of the line from Pirates of the Caribbean that they're not actually rules, they're more like guidelines. And that's what games are, is they just put constraints on your behavior, but whatever you do within that space that adheres to those constraints is possible. And I think back to when I was in high school and we would play split screen GoldenEye at my friend's house on his Nintendo 64, and we made up our own rules for what constituted winning or losing. And there was one specific map that had a bunch of separate rooms on it, and everybody would claim a room as their house, and you weren't allowed to enter somebody else's house without their permission. And if you did, that gave everyone the opportunity to kill you. Like, you became public enemy number one if you violated somebody's rules about their house. Jeez. And you could let people in to get the ammo or get the special item they wanted or whatever. And that wasn't the design intention of the game, to have a match go on for an hour as people are just kind of sitting
Like if you don't have any friends in school, but you have your online friends, like that's awesome. Or if you don't have any friends in school, but you have like folks that you follow on Twitch that you can watch live and it feels like you're kind of like
Yeah.
hanging out.
And that's the kind of
Like
online
where's the
friendships
line?
that's good.
Yeah, good and bad, or how can we teach that maybe? That's something that kind of gets introduced in schools along with like, I don't know, we talk about like online bullying, but not to the extent that probably should be talked about.
It definitely should be talked about.
Yeah.
It's ever present.
Yeah, and I don't think, you know, the older, I mean, not necessarily all the older generation, but those who don't, who've never played a video game, like, or who have never been in a chat room.
Mhm.
I've never been in a chat room, but like I've heard, you know, things that happen. Just, you know, just like these are the drugs that are bad, or like this is what these will do to you.
Yeah.
This is what maybe some of the issues could potentially be and the effects that they can have on you. Or, you know,
My partner always makes the analogy of the internet as it exists right now is as though we invented the car and then we made no safety provisions for the car and then gave everybody cars. We're like, no! And that's where we are with the internet right now. And we need education and training about how to healthfully use the internet in ways that are not going to crash headfirst into other internet users. So I think that was like over time, the way that we use this incredible fast information change. I think that like equipping students, equipping them with this is a seatbelt. This is, you know, like teaching people some of the rules of the road can be really beneficial as we start to develop and create systems by which we can have a little bit more oversight on how we're engaging with one another in these contexts.
because online, personal, right, visually see this person is getting comfortable.
Yeah.
Let me take a step back. And I feel like,
And it feels so righteous when you're angry,
yes, it's just easy to get caught up.
spit it all out onto the internet too. It
Yeah.
feels good for a second.
Yeah, that's why I don't have any social media accounts.
And a lot of times the answer to like, oh, problems is just, or at least from like parents' perspective is, I'm gonna take this away now. Like, this seems like it's causing you problems. I'm just gonna take it away. Instead of giving you the tools that you need to navigate this space appropriately, or like at the level that you can or want to participate.
When you just take away though, you don't solve the problem, but you do create distrust and resentment.
Yes, and I think that like, I don't know, the phone now, like essentially we're all cyborgs. Like if that was in my arm, I'm a cyborg. And like, so taking that away from a child who, or like a student who has like, to me, I don't know if it's like maintaining it, but it feels very
It's like your
much
digital
like,
life.
yeah, you're taking away like my clothes or like my bed or something.
Yeah.
This is the absurdity in which I live. Every day I say this multiple times. All right, everybody. I don't actually say this because I'm not a jerk, but I'm supposed to say this. All right, everybody. I want to see those cell phones put away. No screens. You
Yeah.
gotta stop staring at those cell phones. All right, now take out your Chromebooks.
Yeah.
And I'm not kidding. That's what we do. That's what's happening in schools.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
it's
yeah, definitely another conversation we should chat. Because I'm like, how can I use the phone more as like a device, like, I don't know, you pay or your parents are paying like thousands of dollars for this device for you every year. How can we use it more?
yeah.
Especially now, what's the point of memorizing anything when you can look it up in 2 seconds on your phone? I don't want to teach you the facts. I want to teach you how to access the information.
My wife is an English teacher and she's leading her department going from high school to middle school because she works exclusively with people in her department who think that way, that, oh, it's memorization. In English, you have to memorize what is the green light a metaphor for? Real deep
Times are
digging.
changing, yeah, and education is the last to hop on the
And the problem is the only way to like change a teacher's mind is wait for them to retire and get replaced.
Um, just like on the topic of like chat rooms and mental health, etc., I'm thinking of VR chat and just the ways that like virtual interactions have kind of like changed things and how there are so many new both solutions and problems that come along with that. Just um, like I think a lot of things are really great about VR chat, where you go into it and the very first thing they do is they say, hey, here are all of the ways that you can be presented on screen and can move around. There are things for comfort, like, oh, do you want your character to teleport from place to place, or do you want to like move around just because people can get sick in VR? And then they list like all of these options of, oh, here's how you like mute yourself, or here's how you block other players, or here's how you report players, here's how you like, etc. Like there's a personal space bubble that you can turn on so that they can't get too close to you. So there are a lot of things right out the gate that they're like, hey, we realize that now that you're in a place where it feels like you have a body, we need more things to help that be okay. But it really isn't still. And like there are like you go into it and like sometimes it's just it is a chat room. It has all of the unfortunate advantages of being online, of being anonymous, and being able to say whatever you want without any real repercussions most of the time. And it loses those advantages of, well, now you're not face to face, so some of that isn't quite as impactful if someone's trying to act negatively toward you. So like just thinking of recent examples of like just people posting things online that happened to them, and it's like, well, the very first thing I saw when I opened up VR chat is like a group of 6 people shouting the N-word together and then laughing, and or like so it's like very new territory of it being much harder. Like there are so many things that can be hurtful to people, but on the other hand, there are so many ways that VR chat has helped so many people, especially like during the pandemic when no one was able to see anyone in person. Being able to feel like you're with other people is so helpful, and you can feel like you're connecting with people on a level that you really can't just in a chat room that isn't virtual like that. And just having those, like in addition to talking to other people, being able to like move in a physical space and interact with people has so many benefits.
There was, there was a little while where they were teaching classes in World of Warcraft where like there was a teacher, at least a few teachers did this, where they didn't have a physical space to teach from. So they would assemble classes of students that would meet in World of Warcraft, and they would just do school. They would learn. And one of the things that they discovered was that when you moved it into a virtual space was that the student interactions transformed. Kids who would not interact with each other IRL were suddenly connecting because it became a pure meritocracy. If somebody was skilled at a certain part of the job, they'd get a rep. They'd say, oh, you're having a hard time with that. Well, you should go talk to Derek over there, or or just go talk to Sarah. She's really good at that. And you'd pick, and they'd like, kids would almost like, who were never popular would get like semi-celebrity status within their classes. And it was benefiting everybody across the board. So there's a positive side to it if handled and moderated. I think that's the key difference. It's all in that positive adult involvement and moderation. You can't be Lord of the Flies. Yeah. It could so easily turn into that.
Yeah.
As fun as it would be to sit back with your popcorn and there are actual parents and boards of ed to answer to, unfortunately.
Moderation. I gotta step away for right now. The whole conversation about toxicity and on the internet. It's definitely a whole other thing, and maybe that could be a subject for another conference. That would definitely be a lot, but either way, it's definitely something to think about. But this talk has certainly given me a lot to ponder over with mental health. And we have to tell, thank you for suggesting it, Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you, Griffin.
I'm going to bow out right now. You'll have a good day.
Maybe our grandkids can solve the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hopefully I'll see you all at dinner as well. That's the other thing. See you at dinner.
See you later.
No,
It was like
anyone else?
very exciting.
Yeah, your topic was very inspirational to us all. Yeah,
I think I benefited very much like, from my thesis.
that's the goal. That's why we're here. Yeah.
This year?
No, like thank you.
Oh, okay. With 2 more years, we'll get to see the plan. It's hard to, well, you kind of have to pick your idea and then you gotta stick with it for the next 2 years.
I took an easy pass. I just like creating a game about what like personal experience. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like a win-win.
Kara, there was a video from the Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, of one of the performances, I guess you would call it, that I had saw that at the time I wondered about, and your explanation of it made perfect sense. It was some like smart aleck decided he was gonna like flick at like a stormtrooper or something, or like Kylo Ren, and he was gonna be like, this smart guy. And the actor playing Kylo Ren just stopped everything and turned around and just like, no, you're not worth it. And it was this improvised like little scene that he played out with some random who like the guy was not prepared for it at all. Like he was like, oh no, the performers are coming into the audience, oh no. And that made I saw this like, whoa, this actor that they hired, he totally went off script. Disney's letting this stuff fly now? And then I see you explain, it's like, oh, that was the plan the whole time. This was smart people completely fooled me. It was that convincing. Like,
Much of the magic of what is being created, I think, right now at Disney that I've been able to comes from the people. It comes from the actors. It comes from this collaborative process by which we have given them permission to act within their best knowledge and instincts and to follow their characters and follow, within certain parameters, like we can't drop F-bombs on stage.
sure.
There's like, there are boundaries that we follow for ourselves. But a lot of the best interactions come from people, when people act out towards the cast or act aggressively, it's because they're raising their hand, they're saying, I want attention and I want to play with you. And so we train our actors to think of it like that, to not think of it as an aggressive move. Think of it as I'm invested. I want to play, and find a way to play with them so that it's not shutting them down, so that you can incorporate them, or you can pull them in even further. So one of my favorite things, we have our Lieutenant Croy on the Star Cruiser, the bad guy. There are stormtroopers as well, but they have a pretty limited set of dialogue that they can do. For Lieutenant Croy, it's just a free roaming performer, and a lot of the scenes that he has are unscripted, completely unscripted. He's got intentions, but he's going around and he's just trying to see who wants to play with him. And a lot of the interactions that the actors have with people are, then he'll walk up to them and they'll be like, "Who on you? You're the worst. We hate you." Blah blah blah. And then a lot of them, when we first started the process, like the reaction to that was like, "Oh, okay, fine. I don't think those people." I'm like, no. Objections are a buying sign, right? This means that that person is interested in playing with you. Engage with them. Ask them why. Oh, why don't you want to talk? Oh. Well, tell me more about that. Tell me more, like why don't you think that what the first order stands for is right? Because they're asking for you to give them that platform by saying like, "F you, buddy,"
That's please tell that what you just said to every teacher you encounter. As a personal favor to me, please. Just because that's like, from a classroom perspective, that's unbelievably valuable. Because you're talking about you know, this playing out with stormtroopers and families on vacation. I'm taking, in my imagination, I'm taking that exact same concept and I'm migrating it to the classroom. I'm General Croy, is that? Lieutenant Croy. I'm Lieutenant Croy in this situation, and it's the kids are the kids on vacation. You just completely flip the script on, you know, misbehavior, acting out. Treat acting out in the classroom as, I want attention, well, give it to them. You're their teacher.
I want agency, I want attention.
Mm.
And then giving them authority also helps to diffuse things, because often people are lashing out because they don't feel as though they have agency, they don't have authority. So if you can give them authority, like you probably can't always do this in the context of the teacher, but you can say like, oh, well, how would you like to do it? Like, if you don't like the way that I'm going about this, then what do you want to do instead? What do you suggest that we do? And that often gets really positive responses from people where they're like, well, actually, I do have an idea. Maybe it should be this. And you're like, great. Sounds amazing. Let's do that. Great plan. I'm going to come to you in the future if I need advice. Or they'll say like, oh, actually, I don't know. I'm not sure. And you're like, well, that's okay to come up with something, then let me know. I'm open to listening to you. You know, and that is sometimes just enough. People feeling heard is enough. It's okay for us to meet them where they're at. Oh, to the ton of playtesting. It is not playtesting.
Should I turn this mic off? I don't know what the.
I think I think are they recording? I think they might be recording the session for like, yeah, because they're using the dictation software.
Right, I was curious whether this counts as part of the, like, we've shifted the topic largely.
No
so.
confidential information. Makes me think about how much time, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I was just gonna like, people, like, do you ever get people who stay there? Like, you know.
Occasionally, there will be someone who is grandma has been brought to
Yeah.
Right, grandma has been brought with everybody. We're on a family vacation, and grandma is being, and grandma's like, I don't know what's happening, and I don't know what Star Wars is, and I have no idea what's going on, sometimes, surprisingly, those are the easiest people to involve because they have no preset expectations for what this is. So they're like just thrilled to be a part of it, and like especially when actors give them attention, they're like thrilled.
Yeah.
Thrilled. They've never gotten that kind of attention before, and it's really exciting. So sometimes your best players are people who have zero kind of previous experience with gaming at all. Yeah.
It hadn't occurred to me until just thinking about it in those terms of like role playing as a teacher. And being a teacher is a role and you play the role, but you don't necessarily think of it as being in character. But I kind of do. And I've been, just because that's me and what I'm into. And I'm starting to like put it together. It's like, maybe that's why they like me. Because like, I had a kid tell me, and I've been like gathering all of my feedback, good and bad, trying to figure out what's working, what's not. And one kid, you know, said to me, he's a total annoying kid. You know, the red-haired kid with freckles from The Sandlot? Remember?
Yeah.
He is a clone of that kid in appearance and behavior. It's like, I love this kid because he's like my favorite character from this movie, like pulled out of the screen. But he is so annoying and he is so desperate to like disrupt any situation he can. And after subbing for his gym class, which you can imagine what that was like, at the end of the class, he said, Mr. Benedict, you are my favorite substitute. And because you have so much patience, like you put up with so much from us and you never yell. And I was like, oh, no, that's nice. But it just occurred to me now, it's like, oh, well, of course I never yell because my character wouldn't yell. Because I have an image in my head of what Mr. Benedict, the substitute teacher, is, and he's pretty chill. And yelling is not a major part of his characterization. But it didn't even occur to me that I was role-playing. But yeah, no, I've been doing it this whole damn time.
Absolutely.
seems like if I do it consciously, I'll probably do it better. So, as with anything, right? Yeah.
The self is empty, is what we choose to put into it in the moment.
True, true. It's a very Eckhart Tolle right there.
Just a heads up, if you want to start meandering over to where dinner's gonna be, there's order drinks and stuff now. And